we're in the middle of shooting, and she comes one day to the set to meet Barry for lunch, and I looked at her, and I was immediately smitten. They're more connected to their feelings. They're more emotionally mature than guys. I mean, you hear this all the time.
Hollywood remembers Rob Reiner as a man behind the lens, the steady hand who shaped When Harry Met Sally, Misery, Stand By Me, and The Princess Bride. But long before the applause faded and the director's chair grew quiet, Reiner understood a deeper truth, that his greatest stories were not only written on screen, but lived off it. Born into comedy royalty as the son of Carl Reiner, Rob grew up surrounded by laughter, yet his life was never a simple punchline. Behind the warmth of his films lived a man deeply attentive to women, their strength, their pain, their brilliance. In rare interviews, memoir reflections, and quiet remarks over decades, Reiner revealed an enduring admiration for 6 women who shaped his heart, his craft, and his legacy. Who were they to him? Muses, collaborators, confidants, or mirrors of his own unfinished longings? And what did he say about them when the cameras stopped rolling? In this video, we step into the memories he left behind, where admiration became legacy and love took many forms. Number 1. Penny Marshall. Before Rob Reiner was a celebrated director, before Hollywood trusted him with timeless stories, he was a young actor trying to survive the chaos of television comedy. And beside him, loud, fearless, unapologetically real, was Penny Marshall. They met on the set of All in the Family in the early 1970s, where Reiner played the socially conscious meathead, and Marshall appeared as his character's neighbor. But history would remember them best for Laverne and Shirley, where Reiner directed many early episodes and watched Penny transform raw humor into cultural electricity. In interviews years later, Reiner admitted Penny was one of the most instinctively brilliant people he had ever worked with, someone who didn't intellectualize comedy, but felt it. What bound them wasn't romance, it was recognition. Penny saw through Rob's famous last name. Rob saw through Penny's rough edges. In her 2002 memoir, My Mother Was Nuts, Marshall wrote about how male directors often underestimated her. Yet she made a point to single out Reiner as someone who never talked down. He listened. That mattered more than applause. Their bond deepened when Penny stepped behind the camera herself. When Big became a massive success in 1988, Reiner publicly praised her, telling the New York Times that her direction carried heart without manipulation. Privately, he admired her courage, a woman breaking barriers in a male-dominated industry without asking permission. But time has a way of changing rhythms. As careers expanded, their paths diverged. Penny battled personal struggles, addiction, health issues, and the weight of expectations. Reiner, in later interviews after her death in 2018, spoke with visible emotion, calling her a force of nature who paid a price for her honesty. There was no scandal between them, no betrayal, only the quiet ache of watching someone you admire fight storms you cannot stop. To Rob Reiner, Penny Marshall was never just a collaborator. She was a reminder that genius is often messy, laughter is sometimes armor, and the people who shape us most are the ones who never try to impress us at all. Number 2. Elizabeth McGovern. In the early 1980s, Hollywood was learning to trust Rob Reiner not just as an actor, but as a storyteller with restraint. That restraint would become essential when he worked with Elizabeth McGovern on She's Having a Baby, 1988, a film that quietly carried many of Reiner's own fears about adulthood, marriage, and emotional responsibility. McGovern arrived on set with something rare, classical poise mixed with emotional openness. She was already respected for Ragtime and Once Upon a Time in America, yet she carried none of the arrogance fame often breeds. In later interviews, Reiner described her as disarmingly honest, noting that she could express disappointment, longing, and strength in the same breath. What made their collaboration notable was Reiner's choice to step back. In his commentary for the film's later home release, he admitted that McGovern knew the silences better than I did. He allowed scenes to breathe, a decision that mirrored his admiration for her quiet authority. This was not a woman to be directed harshly, but trusted. Years later, McGovern reflected on the experience in a rare interview, saying Reiner created an environment where she felt protected but never confined. For a young actress navigating an industry that often confused control with leadership, that balance left a lasting impression. Their connection was professional, not personal, yet deeply emotional. Reiner was married at the time, and McGovern would soon step away from Hollywood to focus on music and family life. But in interviews, Reiner would later reference She's Having a Baby as one of his most vulnerable films, one that asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. Elizabeth McGovern represented something Rob Reiner admired but could never possess: serenity without surrender. She embodied a version of adulthood that didn't shout, didn't dominate, didn't demand. And perhaps that's why their collaboration lingers, like a song that plays softly in the background of a life, never claiming attention, yet impossible to forget. Number 3. Michelle Singer Reiner. Before Rob Reiner became a defining voice of American cinema, before awards and legacy hardened his public image, there was Michelle Singer, the woman who knew him when ambition was still fragile and success was only a hope whispered late at night. They married in 1989, at a moment when Reiner's career was accelerating rapidly. When Harry Met Sally would soon become a generational landmark, but behind that triumph was a marriage navigating the invisible strain of Hollywood momentum. Michelle, a photographer by trade, lived largely outside the machinery of fame. She observed more than she performed, and that difference mattered. In rare comments following their divorce in 1994, Reiner spoke carefully, never publicly assigning blame. In a Vanity Fair profile years later, he reflected that timing is everything, and sometimes love arrives when you don't yet know who you are. It was one of the few moments he acknowledged the cost of personal growth. Michelle never sought the spotlight, and that restraint defined their relationship. Friends later noted that she provided stability during Reiner's most demanding creative years, grounding him when success threatened to overtake self-awareness. Yet stability alone cannot compete with a life constantly moving forward. Their separation was quiet, devoid of scandal. No bitter interviews, no public regret performances. Michelle remarried and built a life away from Hollywood. Reiner, years later, would say in a 2010 interview that his early marriages taught him how much damage ambition can do when it isn't shared. What makes Michelle Singer Reiner unforgettable in Reiner's story is not drama. It is intimacy without spectacle. She loved him before the myth formed, before audiences associated his name with timeless love stories he himself was still learning to live. Some relationships don't define careers. They define humanity. And in Rob Reiner's life, Michelle Singer remains the chapter written before the world began reading. Number 4. Michelle Pfeiffer. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Michelle Pfeiffer had become something rare in Hollywood, a star whose beauty never eclipsed her intelligence. To Rob Reiner, she represented a kind of cinematic ideal: restraint, discipline, and emotional precision wrapped in quiet power. They never shared a romantic history, nor did they collaborate extensively on film. And yet, in multiple interviews across the years, Reiner singled Pfeiffer out as an actress he deeply admired, not for her allure, but for her seriousness. In a Directors Guild discussion in the mid-1990s, Reiner spoke of Pfeiffer as someone who understands the weight of silence, praising her ability to let emotion linger without explanation. At a time when Hollywood often reduced women to spectacle, Pfeiffer resisted that flattening. Films like The Fabulous Baker Boys and Dangerous Liaisons proved she could command a frame without excess. Reiner, whose own films depended on emotional honesty rather than visual flash, saw in her a kindred philosophy. He once remarked that Pfeiffer was one of the few stars who never seemed impressed by stardom. That distance intrigued him. There was no pursuit, only respect. In later reflections, Reiner suggested that admiration, when left untouched, can sometimes be purer than love. It asks for nothing. It leaves no scars. Pfeiffer, known for fiercely guarding her private life, never publicly commented on Reiner. But those who worked with both described a mutual understanding. Two artists who recognized discipline in one another. In a life filled with collaborations and intimate partnerships, Michelle Pfeiffer stood apart. She was not a chapter written in emotion, but in observation. A reminder that some connections are meant to inspire rather than entangle. Number 5. Kathy Bates. When Rob Reiner decided to adapt Stephen King's Misery in 1990, he knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. The story was brutal, claustrophobic, and psychologically unforgiving. A sharp departure from the warmth audiences associated with his name. What he needed was not just an actress, but an ally. In Kathy Bates, he found exactly that. Bates was not a conventional Hollywood star at the time. She was a seasoned theater actress with decades of work behind her, yet little mainstream recognition. Reiner later admitted in interviews that studio executives questioned the casting. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't famous, but Reiner saw something deeper. A woman fearless enough to disappear into darkness without asking to be protected from it. In DVD commentaries and retrospective interviews, Reiner spoke candidly about how Bates never flinched. She trusted his instincts, even when scenes demanded emotional brutality. The infamous hobbling scene, now etched into film history, was approached with clinical calm. Bates later recalled that Reiner was meticulous, respectful, and deeply concerned about psychological safety, a rare quality for a male director handling violent material. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, not power. Bates would later say that Reiner treated me like an artist, not a risk. That trust paid off. Her performance won the Academy Award for Best Actress, the first time a woman won for a horror role. Years later, Reiner reflected that Misery changed how Hollywood viewed him, and how he viewed women's strength. Kathy Bates was proof that vulnerability and ferocity could coexist in the same frame. She wasn't a muse in the romantic sense. She was something rarer, a collaborator who believed in his darkest vision when others doubted it. And in Rob Reiner's legacy, Kathy Bates remains the woman who walked willingly into the shadows and emerged triumphant. Number 6. Meg Ryan. When Rob Reiner cast Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally, 1989, he was not searching for a star, he was searching for truth. Ryan was still early in her career, known more for promise than permanence. What Reiner saw, however, was emotional transparency. A woman who could turn vulnerability into strength without losing warmth. Their collaboration became legendary. The film, co-written by Nora Ephron, was shaped by Reiner's own divorce and reflections on love's endurance. Ryan became the emotional conduit for those questions. In interviews, Reiner openly admitted that Sally's fears, hopes, and contradictions echoed his own unresolved beliefs about relationships. Meg Ryan later recalled that Reiner created a space where emotion was never rushed. He let moments breathe, she said, in a 1990s retrospective, noting that he respected pauses as much as dialogue. That trust allowed her performance to feel lived in, not acted. Though rumors occasionally surfaced, there was never a romantic relationship between them. Their bond was artistic, deeply human, and enduring. Reiner would go on to direct Ryan again in French Kiss, 1995, reinforcing their creative shorthand. By then, Ryan had become America's sweetheart, Yet Reiner always spoke of her not as an icon, but as an actress brave enough to be unguarded. As Ryan's career later faced harsh public scrutiny, Reiner defended her quietly, refusing to reduce her to tabloid narratives. In later years, he referenced When Harry Met Sally as a film that understood love before cynicism took over. Meg Ryan wasn't just part of Reiner's success, she was part of his emotional vocabulary. Through her, he told the world that love is messy, hopeful, flawed, and worth believing in anyway. And long after the screen faded to black, their story continued, not as romance, but as shared truth. Rob Reiner's legacy was never built alone. It was shaped, softened, and challenged by women who stood beside him. Not as footnotes, but as forces. Penny Marshall taught him fearlessness. Elizabeth McGovern showed him grace without surrender. Michelle Singer Reiner knew him before the myth took form. Michelle Pfeiffer reminded him that admiration doesn't always need possession. Kathy Bates trusted his darkest instincts. And Meg Ryan gave his questions about love a voice the world could hear. In interviews late in life, Reiner often spoke less about awards and more about gratitude. These women, in different ways, taught him how to listen, to silence, to strength, to regret. Hollywood may remember the films, but history remembers the humanity behind them. So we ask you, which of these relationships do you believe shaped Rob Reiner the most? And which story stayed with you? Share your thoughts below. And if you value stories that honor legacy over gossip, subscribe to Legendary Archives, where Hollywood remembers itself honestly.